On Eilean moor, with salt drying white on the stones and the Flannan case open beside your lamp, we begin in the lighthouse, quietly. Let the rooms settle around you, because there is no hurry here, and the sea has already kept its long silence. You can imagine the first page of the file as something stiff and pale, softened by many hands, with the date written in careful ink and the edges faintly rough beneath your thumb. The Flannan case began in the last days of December, in the year 1900, on a small island west of Lewis, where 3 lighthouse keepers were expected to be waiting for their relief. Their names were James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, and in the old records they appear first as working men, steady men, men whose task was to tend the light. We should keep them that way in our minds, not as shadows in a legend, but as people doing difficult work in a hard and lonely place. The island was called Eilean Moor, the largest of the Flannan Isles. Though large is a generous word when you picture it under winter weather, you see rock, turf, steep landings, and the Atlantic moving around it with a slow, heavy breath. The lighthouse stood above that water, new then, only a little more than a year in service, with its lantern room cleaned and watched, its stores counted, its routines written down in ordinary script. You can almost hear the dull ring of a boot on stone stairs, the scrape of a chair across a floor, the soft rasp of paper when a keeper turns a page in the log. For most of us, a lighthouse feels like a symbol from far away, a single point of warmth in a dark sea. But for the men who lived there, it was work. There were lamps to maintain, lenses to polish, weather to note, meals to cook, coal to carry, and signals to watch for through mist and spray. In the Flannan Lighthouse, the days would have been shaped by chores more than mystery. You would know the smell of oil, the dampness in wool, the cold touch of metal railings, and the particular quiet that follows a gale, when even the building seems to be listening. The last confirmed routine contact with the island had been earlier that month, before the weather closed in and the usual rhythm became difficult. Out at sea, passing vessels depended on the light, and those on shore depended on schedules, but winter has a way of bending schedules into patient waiting. When you sit with this first section of the file, you notice how much of the story is made from absence. A light not seen when it should have been seen, a boat delayed by weather, a landing postponed until the sea allowed it. These are not loud details, they are quiet ones, and they ask to be handled gently. On the evening of the 15th of December, a passing steamer later reported that the light had not been visible. Even that detail comes to us through the careful machinery of records, reports, and recollections, and we should hold it with the calm respect that old evidence deserves. A missing light was not a small thing, yet it did not instantly create the story that later grew around the Flannan case. At first it was a problem to be checked, a practical matter, a question in the margin. You can picture someone making a note of it, perhaps with cold fingers, perhaps by poor light, while the weather outside pressed against glass. Then came the delay. The relief vessel, the Hesperus, was due to bring a replacement keeper and supplies, but rough weather kept her from reaching Eilean Moor when expected. In this case, time did not move cleanly from question to answer. It pooled, it waited, it stretched across grey mornings and dark afternoons, while the sea remained too restless for a landing. You can feel that waiting in the file, the way one date gives way to the next without explanation, just wind, spray, and the slow turning of obligation. By the time the Hesperus finally reached the Flannan Isles on the 26th of December, the island must have looked both familiar and wrong. The lighthouse was there, the rocks were there, the landing place was there, but no keeper came down to meet the boat. That is one of the first human details that stays with you. Not a dramatic image, only a missing custom, a relief boat arriving, men scanning the shore, and no figure appearing where a figure should have appeared. You listen for a shout that never comes. You look for movement against the rock, and the rock gives back nothing. Joseph Moore, the relief keeper, went ashore and climbed toward the lighthouse. We can follow him slowly, without trying to make the walk larger than it was. The path would have been exposed, the air wet with salt, the ground uneven underfoot. Each step brought him closer to a building that should have held voices. Warmth, ordinary disorder, the signs of men who had been living and working there. You can imagine the weight of his coat, the taste of sea air, and the particular unease of approaching a workplace that has gone too still. Inside, the lighthouse did not answer in any simple way. The keepers were not there. Some accounts describe the kitchen as orderly, the lamps tended, the clock stopped, and the beds left in ways that suggested interruption, though over time the details have been repeated, reshaped, and sometimes embroidered. We have to be careful now, you and I, because the Flannan case became a home for many editions. A chair said to be overturned, a meal said to be untouched, a log said to contain words too strange to ignore. Some of these details belong more to later tellings than to the reliable core of the record. That is one reason the case went cold inside the lighthouse itself. The building held clues, but it did not hold a clear answer. It offered absence, and absence is difficult evidence. You can weigh a coat, inspect a door, count oilskins, and read a log entry, but you cannot cross-examine an empty room. The lighthouse gave investigators a scene that felt almost ordinary, and yet ordinary in the wrong arrangement. 3 men gone, no direct witness, no final message that settled the matter, only the sea outside, and the pages left behind. When the first search began, it followed the practical mind of men who knew island work. They checked the lighthouse, they checked the landings, they looked for signs along the rocks and near the cranes used for supplies. The west landing mattered, because storms could strike there with force, tearing at ropes, rails, boxes, and anything left too near the edge. You can place yourself beside the searchers, boots slipping slightly on wet stone, eyes moving over seaweed, ironwork, and broken things, trying to read a language the weather had partly erased. The official investigation was led by Robert Muirhead of the Northern Lighthouse Board, a man who knew the service and knew what lighthouse keeping required. His task was not to create a legend. His task was to understand what had happened to 3 employees under his board's care. In the old papers, that distinction matters. You can feel the difference between folklore and administration, between a whispered story and a report written for people who needed decisions. Muirhead looked at damage on the island, the missing gear, the condition of the landings, and the likely movements of the men. The west landing showed signs of severe weather. A box used for equipment had been damaged or disturbed, ropes and other materials were affected, and the sea had clearly reached with great strength into places where men might have gone to secure property. In this quieter reading of the Flannan case, we do not need to imagine anything theatrical. It may be enough to picture workmen doing what lighthouse keepers did, stepping out after or during rough weather to protect equipment, check damage, or secure something loose before it was lost. Such work was routine, and routine work can still meet terrible conditions, yet even a practical explanation did not close the case. If one man went out, why did the others follow? If 2 went to the landing, why was the 3rd not safely inside? If regulations required someone to remain with the light, had those rules been bent by concern, necessity, or misunderstanding? These are the questions you find penciled again and again in the margins of later thought. They are not shouted questions. They are quiet, stubborn ones. They remain because the scene gave no final arrangement of facts that everyone could accept. There is a particular patience in old investigations, and the Flannan case asks for that patience from the very beginning. You cannot rush weather. You cannot ask the Atlantic to return what it has taken. You cannot bring back the exact pattern of a wave after it has broken and withdrawn into itself. So investigators did what investigators often do when certainty is gone. They gathered what could be gathered, They compared timing, duties, damage, and custom. They listened to men who knew the island, and they tried to make a human sequence from scattered traces. As you turn the next page, the case becomes less about one empty room and more about the slow difficulty of knowing what an empty room can mean. The lighthouse was built to make danger visible to others, but it could not explain the danger that came to its own door. That is the quiet heart of the matter. A place designed for warning became a place of uncertainty. A light meant to mark the rocks left behind, a mystery shaped by rock, weather, and the limits of human record. The more you sit with Eilean Moore, the more the island itself becomes part of the evidence. It was not simply a background. It was a working environment, a small and exposed piece of land where every landing had a character, every path had a habit, and every storm left marks that could mislead or clarify depending on how carefully they were read. You can imagine the file widening here, from the rooms of the lighthouse to the slopes outside, from the smell of paraffin and damp cloth to the raw mineral scent of stone after rain. The Flannan Lighthouse had two principal landings, east and west, because boats needed options depending on wind and sea. That sounds simple on paper, but on the island it meant labor, judgment, and risk. Supplies had to be hauled, moorings had to be watched, gear had to be secured against weather that did not care about schedules. If you were one of the keepers, you would know the sound of waves before you saw them, the way a change in wind could move through the building, and the difference between ordinary roughness and something worth checking. The West Landing drew attention because of the reported storm damage there. Muirhead noted signs that strong seas had come up with unusual force, affecting equipment at a height that seems, even now, hard to picture calmly. But the Atlantic near the Flannans does not need our imagination to be powerful. It has its own record. The waves there can rise and strike rock with a weight that turns familiar ground into something briefly unrecognizable. You can stand in your mind near the landing, hearing the low boom below, feeling spray cool on your face, and understand why a small misjudgment could matter. Still, the investigators had to ask whether the men would have gone out together. Lighthouse rules discouraged leaving the light unattended, but rules live inside real moments, and real moments have weather, urgency, and human concern. Perhaps one man saw damage and called for help. Perhaps two went out, and the third followed when they did not return. Perhaps the timing was not neat at all. You and I do not need to force these possibilities into certainty. We can let them remain possibilities, as the official record largely did. One of the gentlest ways to read the case is to remember how ordinary responsibility can draw people into danger. A loose rope, a damaged box, a crane that might be lost, a landing that needed checking before the next boat arrived. These are small practical matters. They are exactly the kind of things working men notice. In the Flannan case, the most likely explanations are not strange ones, but human ones, built from duty and weather. You can feel the weight of that in the silence after the searchers returned with no answer. The island searches found no bodies. That absence deepened everything. Had the men been swept into the sea did not return them, at least not in any way that settled the record. Around islands like these, currents can carry evidence far beyond the place where questions begin. Clothing, tools, and human traces can vanish into motion. For an investigator, that is one of the hardest kinds of loss. The scene remains, but the final confirmation is gone. The file stays open because nature has kept the last page. By the time Muirhead wrote his report, he leaned toward an explanation involving the sea. He believed the men may have been taken by an unexpectedly large wave while near the West Landing, perhaps while securing gear after storm damage. It was a sober conclusion, not a theatrical one. It fit the island. It fit the damage. It fit the work. And yet it remained a conclusion built from inference, because no one had watched the final moments, and no recovered evidence could make the sequence complete. This is where the Flannan case begins to go cold in the particular way old maritime cases often do. The facts do not disappear all at once. They become fixed. The lighthouse is examined. The damage is recorded. The search is made. The report is written. Then the weather changes again. The men are mourned. The lighthouse service continues, and the file begins its long life as something no longer active in the ordinary sense, but never truly settled in the human sense. You can almost feel the paper cooling as the ink dries. The families of James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur had to live with that incomplete answer. We should stay with that for a moment, quietly. For the public, the case became a mystery. For those closest to the men, it was an absence at the table, a wage no longer coming home, a name spoken differently after the news arrived. The old reports rarely give us the full private weight of such things. They offer names, dates, positions, and findings. The rest has to be approached with care. When you hold this part of the file, you might notice how gently the human element resists being turned into legend. Ducat was the principal keeper. Marshall was an experienced second assistant. MacArthur was serving as an occasional keeper, brought into the rotation. These were not symbols placed on an island for a story. They were workers in a difficult service, with habits, tempers, loyalties, tiredness, and pride. They knew the building not as a Gothic tower, but as a place of shifts, meals, maintenance, and long nights. The lighthouse itself continued after them. That is another quiet fact. The light still had to be kept. Ships still needed guidance. New men came to Eilean Moor and lived with the knowledge of what had happened there, or rather what had not been fully known there. Imagine arriving after the disappearance, carrying your own sea bag, smelling oil and damp stone in rooms recently searched, and hearing the wind move around a place already becoming a story. You would work anyway. That was the nature of the service. But there was one more detail that shaped the long memory of the Flannan case, and it came not from the island's rocks alone, but from the way stories change when they are carried by many voices. The first thing you notice, when you follow that thread, is how softly a fact can gather extra clothing as it travels. A keeper's log becomes a diary of fear, though the surviving record is more practical than that. A kitchen becomes frozen in a dramatic pause, though official descriptions were plainer. A missing oilskin becomes a clue with 100 meanings, though on a working island it may have meant only haste, habit, or weather. In the Flannan case, you learn to listen for the difference between what was recorded and what was remembered later. That difference matters, because cold cases are often cooled further by ornament, not always by dishonesty, and not always by carelessness, but by the human need to give shape to silence. You and I understand that need. When 3 men vanish from a lighthouse, the mind reaches for a pattern, and if the pattern is incomplete, imagination supplies a border. Over years, newspaper retellings, poems, radio features, and late-night conversations turned Eilean Moor into something almost dreamlike. The island became quieter, stranger, and more symbolic than it had been in the working records. The famous logbook passages deserve this patient attention. Many later versions say the log described terrible winds, unusual behavior, and men weeping or praying, even before the storm was officially recorded. Those lines have long circulated around the Flannan mystery, but they do not sit securely in the known official evidence. As you turn this page, you can almost feel the file resisting the legend. The paper asks you to slow down. It asks you to ask where each sentence came from, who first printed it, and whether it belongs to the keepers or to the story that grew after them. There is something tender in that kind of checking. It is not cold skepticism, it is care. If we remove a false detail, we are not making the case smaller. We are giving the real men back their real room, their real weather, their real labor, and their real silence. You can sit with the log as a working object, a place where keepers noted wind, sea, lamp condition, and routine matters. Its power does not depend on theatrical entries. It is moving enough because it was part of their ordinary life. The same patience applies to the reported meal. Some tellings place food on the table, untouched, as if the men had risen together in the middle of a domestic moment. The image is strong. It is also uncertain. Official accounts do not support every dramatic version of it, and the more careful you become, the more you notice how such images pull the mind toward urgency. We do not need urgency here. We can let the kitchen be what it may have been, a worked-in room, cold by the time Moore entered, with the small signs of interrupted life scattered in practical ways. You can imagine the smell of that room without turning it into theater. Damp wool near a peg, ash or coal dust near a hearth, the faint sourness of provisions stored against weather, tin, wood, salt, lamp oil, and the chill of a building that no longer had men moving through it. These are quieter impressions, but they stay. They let the lighthouse be inhabited again, not as a stage, but as a place where people had eaten, slept, written, climbed stairs, and listened to the sea speaking through stone. The missing oilskins are another detail you handle gently. In some accounts, one set remained inside, suggesting one man went out without proper protection. In others, the interpretation shifts. Clothing in a lighthouse was practical, and practical things can become complicated after the fact. You can picture a coat hanging heavy with salt, stiff at the hem, its sleeves creased from daily use. You can also picture a hurried choice, a brief step outside that became longer than expected, or a man thinking he would return quickly. None of these possibilities can be proved into certainty. This is how the Flannan case went cold inside the lighthouse, not because there were no clues, but because the clues were humble and unfinished. A door, a coat, a log, a damaged landing, a stopped routine. Each thing could be placed into more than one human sequence. Investigators could make the most reasonable arrangement, and they did, but the room did not close around a single answer. You sit there with the file, and you begin to understand that a cold case is sometimes not a locked door. Sometimes it is a door standing open onto weather. The weather itself had to be studied through reports, memory, and damage, and even there the evidence had edges. The Flannan Isles sit in a part of the Atlantic where storms can pass with an authority that is difficult to translate into ink. A report can say rough seas. A witness can say heavy swell. A damaged box can say more than either, but only if you trust that you understand when and how it broke. You can feel the investigator's problem under your hand. The island spoke through marks, but the marks had no voice of their own. We should linger with Robert Muirhead for a while, because his patience shaped the official understanding. He had known the men, or at least known the world they worked in, and he visited the island after the disappearance. His conclusions came from familiarity, not fantasy. He saw the damage near the West Landing and considered the possibility that the keepers had gone there to secure equipment. You can imagine him walking the exposed ground, coat buttoned against wind, eyes moving from rock to rope to crane, measuring not only distance, but habit. Habit is a form of evidence in lighthouse work. A keeper does not wander randomly around his station. He moves because something needs doing. He knows where gear is stored, where waves strike hardest, where a rope should lie, and how long a task usually takes. In the Flannan case, Muirhead's understanding of habit made the sea explanation stronger. It did not require strange behavior. It required only men responding to a problem in a place where problems could become dangerous very quickly. That kind of explanation is quiet, but it has weight. Yet the case still resisted closure, because habit can explain movement, but not every decision. You might ask, as others have asked, why all three men were outside. You might ask whether one man went first, whether another followed to help, whether the third came after them, perhaps worried by delay. These questions feel small, but they carry the whole difficulty. The difference between one sequence and another might be only minutes. The file cannot give those minutes back. You can look at the page as long as you like, and the margin remains blank. The sea, too, kept its own counsel. If a great wave took the men from the rocks, it took the strongest evidence with them. No final position, no last object in place, no witness standing safely above. The Atlantic can erase not only footprints, but arrangements. It can pull away a body, scatter equipment, polish a surface clean, and leave later searchers with the uneasy feeling that something happened exactly there, though the proof has gone out with the tide. As you read, you hear that erasure like a soft, repeated hush. In patient detective work, there is often a moment when investigators know the most likely answer, but not enough to make it final. That is a very human place to stand. It is not ignorance, and it is not certainty. It is the space between them, where reasonable minds can agree on probability and still feel the absence of proof. The Flannan case lives there. A sea accident may explain it. A sudden wave may explain it. The damage near the West Landing may point toward it, but the exact last act remains beyond the page. Years passed, and the lighthouse became more than a workplace in public memory, though for the service it remained a station with duties. That is another slow turn in the file. You watch a practical investigation become a cultural mystery. A marine accident becomes a tale told in cottages, newspapers, books, and later documentaries. Each telling keeps the names alive, which is something, but each telling also risks moving them farther from the weathered facts. You and I can keep returning to the workbench, the log, the path, and the landing, where the case is simplest and most sorrowful. The poem written by Wilfred Wilson Gibson, called Flannan Isles, helped shape the public mood around the disappearance. It is not evidence, but it mattered to memory. Poetry can carry atmosphere with a force that official reports never try to carry, and many listeners met the case through that strange, quiet verse before they ever met the documents. You can feel how a poem might settle over the island like mist. It does not have to be false to change the air around the facts. It only has to be memorable. Once a case is remembered through art, later readers often carry that mood back into the evidence. A bare room becomes eerie, a missing coat becomes symbolic, a routine delay becomes an omen. You know how easily that can happen when you are tired, reading late, with the room around you still, and the old paper soft beneath your fingers. This is why we move slowly. We let the art remain art, and the evidence remain evidence. The Flannan case is strong enough to be approached without forcing the two together. Newspaper accounts added their own pressure. Early 20th century newspapers could be careful, but they could also reach for mystery, because mystery holds a reader. Reports traveled from the Scottish coast to wider audiences, and with distance came loosened detail. You might see one paper emphasize the weather, another the empty lighthouse, another the supposed strangeness of the men's absence. Over time, the repetition created a second lighthouse, built from words, standing beside the real one. As detectives of the file, we keep asking which door we are opening. The real lighthouse had dimensions, equipment, smells, and schedules. The story lighthouse had mood. In one, there were lamp glasses, oil, ropes, cranes, ledgers, beds, cupboards, and the practical residue of work. In the other, there were whispers, impossible storms, vanished meals, and a silence so complete it seemed almost designed. You can understand why the story lighthouse lasted. It is easier to remember, but if we are being faithful tonight, we must spend more time in the real building, where the case went cold not from strangeness alone, but from ordinary facts that would not arrange themselves completely. Think of the men's last known days as a set of routines, not as a countdown. That helps. James Ducat, as principal keeper, would have carried responsibility for the station, its records, and its order. Thomas Marshall would have known the duties as second assistant, with the learned attentiveness of a man used to weather and light. Donald MacArthur, serving in place of another keeper, was part of that temporary household. You can imagine three separate temperaments under one roof, sharing work, quiet irritations, meals, and the heavy companionship of isolation. Isolation is sometimes exaggerated in the telling, but it was real enough. The Flannan Isles were remote, and winter made them more so. A lighthouse keeper did not simply step away from the job at the end of a shift. He slept inside the responsibility. Wind could wake him. A change in the light demanded attention. A landing boat might or might not arrive. Letters, news, and relief all depended on weather and schedule. You can feel how time would stretch there, measured by lamp maintenance, meals, and the slow turn of the watch. At night, the lantern would have transformed the building from within. Glass, metal, flame, and lens made a system larger than any one man, and the keepers served that system carefully. The air near the lamp might carry heat and oil, while stone passages below held cold and damp. Boots would sound differently on iron stairs than on floors. A hand on the rail would feel a chill even after hours indoors. In the Flannan case, these details matter because they remind us that the missing men belonged to a pattern of work before they belonged to a mystery. When investigators entered after the disappearance, they were not only looking for clues, they were noticing broken pattern. A lamp that had not been tended as expected, a station that had not signaled welcome to the relief boat, a household whose rhythm had stopped. You can think of investigation as listening for where routine falters. In a city case, it may be an unopened shop or an unanswered appointment. On Eilean Moor, it was no man at the landing, no expected movement, no explanation waiting inside the lighthouse walls. This kind of evidence has a soft texture. It does not announce itself. It accumulates. One absence rests beside another until the mind understands that something has gone badly wrong. Joseph Moore felt that before any formal report could hold it. He knew the station, knew the expected signs of life, and found their absence instead. You can walk beside him in imagination, not with fear, but with the quiet recognition that he was entering a place where his working knowledge no longer matched what he saw. Moore's own experience after the discovery has sometimes been folded into the law too. In a case like this, the relief keeper becomes a witness to silence, and that role is heavy. He had to inspect rooms where colleagues should have been. He had to report absence, not answer. Later, he may have carried that first impression in memory, sharpened by retelling and softened by time. You can imagine how the smell of the building, the cold of the rooms, or the sound of the sea might have stayed with him long after he left the island. Witness memory is not a machine, and old cases teach us that gently. A person remembers what mattered, but what mattered can change shape in the mind. The first sight of an empty station may become clearer in some ways and less reliable in others. That does not mean the witness is careless. It means the witness is human. As you read the Flannan file, you learn to respect memory without making it carry more weight than it can bear. The difference is small, but it matters. Official reports tried to give the case a practical spine. They named dates, conditions, observations, and conclusions. But public memory preferred the feeling of the empty lighthouse, and feeling has its own persistence. This is one reason the Flannan case went cold in more than one sense. The investigation reached a likely explanation, but the public story kept reopening the uncertainty. Each generation returned to the lighthouse, not always to solve it, but to feel the unfinishedness again. You and I are doing something quieter. We are letting the unfinishedness remain, without sharpening it. There is no need to make the men seem afraid in their final days. There is no reliable need for that. It is kinder, and likely truer, to imagine them occupied with work, weather, meals, and the ordinary tensions of a remote posting. The wind may have been loud, the windows may have trembled, the lantern may have needed attention. Someone may have looked toward the landing and seen something that required action. This is enough. A cold case does not need dramatic emotions placed into the mouths of those who cannot correct us. The lighthouse service itself was built on trust in ordinary discipline. Men kept lights because other lives depended on those lights. They followed rules because repetition reduced danger. They recorded conditions because records allowed distant supervisors to understand remote places. When something went wrong, the same structure gave investigators their first tools. In the Flannan case, those tools were useful, but limited. A log could show what had been written. It could not show what happened after the last useful entry. A rule could show what should have happened. It could not prove what did. You can see how each tool reaches a boundary. The building can be searched, but it cannot remember aloud. The landing can be inspected, but it has been washed by weather. The gear can be counted, but missing items may have more than one meaning. The timetable can be reconstructed, but not down to the breath. At that boundary, patient detectives do not invent. They mark uncertainty. They say, this is likely, this is possible, this is unsupported, and this is unknown. Those words may seem plain, but they are acts of care. Across the years, other theories arrived, as they often do when a case remains open in public imagination. Some wondered whether one keeper harmed another, or whether a quarrel led to disaster. Others imagined abduction, escape, or forces beyond ordinary explanation. These theories have circulated, but they sit lightly against the harder evidence. There was no clear sign of a struggle in the reliable record, no solid trail of deliberate departure, no witness to anything stranger than absence. You can let those theories pass like weather outside the glass, while we stay with what the file can bear. The quarrel theory has a human pull because isolation can test people. Anyone who has shared a small space in hard weather can understand that tempers may fray. But understanding a possibility is not the same as finding evidence for it. The Flannan Lighthouse offered no firm proof of violence between the men, and we should not place such a burden on their names without cause. We can acknowledge that people under strain are complicated, while still returning to the sea, the landing, and the storm damage as the steadier ground. The escape theory is even harder to hold. For three keepers to abandon station, family, duty, and identity without leaving a convincing trace would require a chain of choices for which the record gives little support. The island was remote, the weather poor, and the practical means limited. You can imagine how such a theory grows from the romance of disappearance, but the file does not warm to it. It remains cool and factual. The men were working. The relief vessel came. The men were gone. The sea had damaged the landing. That is where the evidence keeps returning. Supernatural explanations belong to folklore, not investigation. The Flannan Isles had older associations in local imagination, and remote islands often gather stories because they stand apart from daily life. But tonight, as you sit beside the lamp with the case file open, we do not need to mock folklore or follow it. We can simply place it on a separate shelf. Folklore tells us how people live with uncertainty. Investigation asks what most likely happened. Both are human, but they are not the same tool. The tool we keep using is patience. You can feel it in the slow comparison of accounts, the careful separation of early reports from later embellishment, and the willingness to leave some spaces blank. Patience is not passive here. It is active restraint. It keeps us from filling the lighthouse with invented cries, invented meals, invented final words. It lets the men remain quiet where the record is quiet. In a sleep story, that restraint has its own gentleness, because it does not demand more than the past can give. When the case went cold, it did not go cold like a neglected file forgotten in a drawer. It cooled because the main facts were gathered early, and there was no new source from which certainty could come. The island had been searched. The lighthouse had been inspected. The sea had not returned the men. No witness emerged from the weather. No confession, document, or physical discovery later changed the central picture. You can almost hear the slow closing of administrative folders, not with indifference, but with the sadness of limits. Limits are an important part of detective work. We often think of investigation as discovery, but much of it is learning where discovery stops. In the Flannan case, the stopping point was not caused by a lack of care. It was built into the conditions. Remote island, winter weather, 3 missing men, a likely accident scene exposed to sea, a delay before landing, no surviving final witness. Each factor narrowed what could be known later. You see them arranged in the file like stones in a wall, not dramatic, but difficult to move. The delay caused by weather is especially important. Had the relief vessel reached the island at once, perhaps more signs would have remained. Perhaps the timing could have been narrowed. Perhaps the sea would not have had as long to erase. But the Hesperus was delayed until the 26th of December, and those lost days mattered. You can feel the frustration in that gap. Not a loud frustration, just the quiet knowledge that weather had kept help away, and then helped hide what help needed to understand. In maritime investigations, timing often depends on tides, logs, sightings, and reports from passing vessels. But around Eilean Moor, the conditions worked against precision. The light may have been unobserved on the 15th. The men were found gone on the 26th. Between those dates lies the long, cold corridor where the answer likely rests. You can walk down that corridor in thought, but there are few doors. Each possible day has its own weather, its own imagined routine, and its own silence. The case went cold partly because that corridor stayed unlit. There is a gentle discipline in not pretending to know the hour. Some retellings press hard on the 15th, treating it as the likely day of disappearance. That may be reasonable, but the old record still leaves room around it. The light's absence gives us an important signal, yet a signal is not the whole story. As you read, you can hold the date carefully, neither ignoring it nor making it carry more than it can carry. This is how patient work feels. It is slower than certainty, but kinder to truth. The physical setting also narrowed the investigation. Eilean Moor was not a town with neighbors, streets, shops, and dozens of witnesses. It was a station surrounded by water. The usual tools of inquiry were reduced. There were no passers-by to interview in the ordinary sense, no broad canvas of homes, no market gossip to test, no railway platform where someone might have seen 3 men traveling under assumed names. There was the lighthouse, the landings, the weather, and the sea. You can feel how small the evidence circle was from the beginning. Small circles can be examined thoroughly, but they do not always contain enough. The island's very remoteness protected the likely explanation from contradiction, while also preventing proof. If a wave took the men, no human eye may have seen it. If they stepped out in sequence, no one stood nearby to mark the order. If one called to another, the wind kept that sound for itself. The file cannot widen beyond its world. You sit with that small circle, and its smallness becomes part of the sorrow. The soundscape of the lighthouse helps us understand this. Imagine wind moving around the tower, not as a dramatic howl, but as constant pressure, sometimes rising, sometimes falling. Inside, you might hear the lamp system, a chair's small creak, the knock of a door not fully settled, the muffled shift of a man moving upstairs. Outside, the sea would speak in layers. Wash, strike, withdraw, and the deeper thud of water meeting rock. In such a place, a call could vanish quickly, a footstep could be missed, a decision could become irreversible before anyone understood it. The West Landing, again, draws us back. It does that in the case because it offers the strongest practical explanation. There had been gear there. There was damage there. The sea had reached there. If you were reading only the island, without the later myths, your eye would return there too. You might kneel near torn turf or displaced equipment, feeling rough stone through your glove, trying to imagine height, spray, and timing. The explanation is not complete, but it is rooted in the ground. and rooted explanations deserve attention. Some later writers questioned whether a wave could have reached so high or acted with such sudden force. That question is fair, but the sea around exposed Atlantic rock can behave in ways that surprise people even with experience. Waves do not arrive as identical lines on a chart. They combine, rise, reflect, and strike through narrow features of land. A larger wave among many smaller ones can seem, to the person facing it, almost without warning. You and I do not have to dramatize that. We only have to respect it. Respecting weather is not the same as making weather mysterious. It is practical humility. Lighthouse keepers respected it because they lived beside it. Investigators respected it because they saw what it could do. On Eilean Moor, a sea accident was not an exotic explanation. It was part of the working risk. That is one of the quieter answers to why the Flannan case went cold. The most likely cause may have been too ordinary, too swift, and too completely washed away to leave the kind of proof a later world wanted. And still, the human mind returns to the empty lighthouse. It returns because rooms feel personal. A wave is vast and impersonal, but a room has cups, beds, coats, and handwriting. We search rooms for intention. We ask what someone was thinking. We read a left object as a sentence half spoken. The Flannan Lighthouse became memorable because the room remained while the men did not. You can sit with that feeling without letting it lead you beyond the evidence. It is enough to say the room made absence visible. Absence has a texture in old files. It appears in phrases like no trace, not found, unable to determine, presumed lost. Those words are plain, but they carry years. You can imagine a clerk writing them, perhaps not knowing that more than a century later someone would still be reading. The ink dries. The page is filed. The lighthouse returns to service. Yet the words keep a small, cold space around them. In the Flannan case, that space is where the mystery continues to breathe. The families would have encountered official language in a more painful way. Presumed explanations may have helped some people, but they could not replace a body, a funeral with certainty, or a final account. It is important to remember that cold cases do not belong only to curious readers. They belong first to those who waited. A wife, a child, a parent, a colleague, someone expecting a return. You can let that thought sit softly. The slow work of investigation is human because it tries, however imperfectly, to answer waiting. For the Northern Lighthouse Board, the disappearance also raised practical concerns. Procedures existed for safety, but procedures are always tested by the unexpected. If all 3 men had gone outside, then the question became not only what happened, but how to prevent such a risk later. Lighthouse work depended on discipline, but also on judgment. You can imagine discussions in offices far from Eilean Moor, with papers spread across desks, the smell of ink and coal smoke in the room, and the sea translated into policy. That administrative aftermath is often less dramatic than the mystery, but it matters. Institutions learn from loss by changing routines, restating rules, checking equipment, and reminding workers of dangers already known but newly sharpened. In the Flannan case, the lesson may have been as simple and heavy as this. No landing gear is worth 3 lives, and no storm damage should draw all hands into danger. Whether stated exactly so or not, the thought belongs beside the report. It is part of the patient human response. You can picture the files moving through offices, the report, correspondence, weather notes, service records, and later inquiries from people drawn to the story. Paper has its own slow life. It waits in cabinets, moves to archives, gathers dust, and becomes brittle at the edges. Someone ties it with tape. Someone labels a folder. Someone requests it years later and opens it under quieter lights. The Flannan case survived partly because paper survived, and because each reader felt that the silence inside it still asked to be understood. Archives are gentle places for unsolved things. They do not solve by themselves, but they preserve the conditions for later patience. You can smell old paper there. A dry, faintly sweet smell, with dust lifting when a box is opened. You can hear the soft tap of a pencil, the careful turn of a page, the distant hum of a building that holds many unfinished stories. In such a room, the Flannan Lighthouse is no longer battered by wind. It is reduced to records, but the records still carry sea air in their words. Researchers who come later often begin with the legend and then work backward. That is a natural path. The legend is the doorway most people find. But the deeper work is quieter. It asks which account came first, which detail appears in official material, which line belongs to a poem, which claim was repeated without checking. This is detective work of another kind, not a search across rocks, but a search across versions. You can do it with a pencil, a notebook, and the willingness to let a favorite detail go. Letting a detail go can feel like loss, especially when it is vivid. The strange log entries, the overturned chair, the untouched meal, the unnatural calm before disaster. These images have atmosphere. They pull at the half-sleeping mind. But if they are not firmly rooted, they can obscure the people we are trying to remember. In the Flannan case, the truer atmosphere is already strong. Winter sea, delayed relief, an empty station, damaged gear, and 3 working men missing from their post. Nothing more is needed. The question in the title, why the Flannan case went cold in the lighthouse, has more than one answer. It went cold because the lighthouse could show absence, but not sequence. It went cold because the sea could remove evidence faster than people could arrive. It went cold because the most likely explanation depended on inference. It went cold because later stories added mist to an already difficult view. And it went cold because, once the immediate search ended, there was no new witness waiting somewhere inland, no hidden document likely to speak. Yet the lighthouse also kept the case warm in memory. That is the paradox. If the men had vanished from an open boat, perhaps the story would have remained a sad maritime loss and little more. But they vanished from a place built for order, vigilance and light. The contrast made people return. You return now, with the file open, because the building feels as though it should know. Its rooms were close to them. Its walls heard their last ordinary hours. But stone does not testify. Stone does, however, hold marks for a while. Investigators looked at those marks. They considered the damaged landing, the displaced equipment, and the conditions under which keepers might have gone outside. This is where the careful mind rests most often. A simple chain forms. Bad weather, damage outside, men go to inspect or secure. A sudden sea takes them. The chain is plausible, and it has remained the central explanation because it asks the least invention. But one missing link remains at the end, and that missing link keeps the case from closing in the heart. The official conclusion used language of likelihood, not witnessed fact. That distinction is small in sound and large in meaning. A finding can be reasonable without being complete. You see this in many old cases, especially those shaped by water, weather, and delay. Investigators may know what probably happened, and still the family may hear only probably. The public may hear probably and turn it into maybe. Then maybe becomes mystery, and mystery becomes legend. In the Flannan case, that progression happens slowly, over many retellings. As we move further into the file, it helps to think about the lighthouse as a workplace designed to resist darkness, but not designed to preserve evidence. Its purpose was service, not investigation. Floors could be cleaned, lamps required maintenance, doors opened to weather, men moved through rooms with tools and clothing. Outside, waves struck, withdrew, and struck again. Nothing about the setting protected a final trace. When the search began, the scene had already been changed by time, weather, and necessity. You can feel the detective's frustration there, even through official restraint. Modern investigators might wish for cameras, radios, satellite weather, precise timestamps, and quick rescue coordination. But in 1900, the The tools were slower. Messages traveled by vessel and wire. Observations depended on people seeing, remembering, and reporting. A remote lighthouse could fall out of contact in a way that today feels almost impossible to imagine. You can sit with that difference gently. The men were not careless because they lacked our tools. They lived in a world where distance still had real weight and weather could close a door for days. The lack of radio contact was central. A modern station might send a message about damage, injury, or danger. The Flannan keepers could not simply call across the sea. If something went wrong quickly, the first outside sign might be the absence of the light itself. That is a hard thought. The warning system for ships became in reverse. The only warning that something was wrong at the station. You can feel the loneliness of that arrangement, not as melodrama, but as infrastructure. The world was connected, but not enough. Those limits shaped every step after the disappearance. By the time anyone could inspect the lighthouse, the crucial moment was already distant. The investigators could not secure a fresh scene in the modern sense. They could not preserve wave marks, footprints, or the exact position of every small object before weather and search activity intervened. They did what could be done with the methods of their time. That is the patient fairness we owe them. It is easy to ask later questions. It is harder to stand in their boots on wet rock. There is a kind of humility in reading old investigations well. We bring later knowledge, but we should not bring easy superiority. The men who searched Eilean Moor understood the sea, the work, and the equipment in ways many later readers do not. They may have lacked modern tools, but they had practical familiarity. When Muirhead leaned toward a sea accident, he was not waving away the mystery. He was reading the island through experience. You can respect that reading while still recognizing why it could not settle every question. The case also reminds us that explanation and closure are not identical. A likely explanation may satisfy a report, but not imagination. It may guide policy, but not grief. It may be the best answer available and still leave a listener awake at night, picturing a lantern room and a silent kitchen. The Flannan case sits in that gap. We can say, with care, that the sea explanation is strongest. We can also say the exact sequence has never been known. Both statements can rest together. In this quiet work, we do not have to choose between compassion and clarity. We can be clear about unreliable details. We can be compassionate toward those who repeated them because they were trying to understand. We can name the likely force of weather without reducing the men to an accident. We can leave room for sorrow without inviting fear. The file allows that kind of balance if we read it slowly. You turn another page, and the paper makes its small sound, like a breath in a sleeping room. By the early years after the disappearance, the outline had already settled. The 3 keepers were missing. The lighthouse had been found unattended. The west landing showed damage. The official view favored a wave or sea accident. No bodies were recovered. No confirmed witness emerged. That outline did not change much, though the stories around it did. You can see how a cold case becomes cold when its core stops moving. Later movement happens around the edge, in interpretation, retelling, and doubt, while the center remains still. Stillness can be difficult for people. We want motion, discovery, correction, a final paper slid from a forgotten envelope. Sometimes old cases provide that. A fingerprint is re-examined, a DNA sample is tested, a witness speaks after decades. A box in an archive changes everything, but the Flannan case is not that kind of cold case, at least not so far. It has no known preserved forensic sample waiting for a laboratory. It has no named suspect whose identity could be tested. Its missing evidence belongs largely to the sea. That makes it feel older than its date. 1900 is not ancient history, but the case has the character of something carried on weather rather than technology. It belongs to the age of lamps, letters, relief boats, and men whose working lives depended on routine in isolated places. You can sense the distance in the vocabulary alone. Principal keeper, relief, landing, board, log, oilskins. Each word has texture. Each word places your hand on a different surface. Paper, rope, cloth, wet stone, polished glass. The lighthouse stairs are worth imagining again, because they connect the worlds inside the case. Down below, the living quarters, stores, and practical rooms. Above, the lantern, the purpose of everything. Outside, the paths to landings and the Atlantic beyond. A keeper's day moved through these layers, up and down, in and out, warmth to cold, light to weather. If the men left the building, they left from a world of duty into a world of force. The transition may have taken only moments. The file cannot follow them through it. You, as the quiet detective tonight, can pause at that threshold, not to dramatize it, just to notice. A door opens, cold air enters, the smell changes from oil and coal to salt and wet rock. A man steps out, perhaps for a task he has done before. Another may follow. The wind takes ordinary words and breaks them apart. Somewhere beyond the door, routine becomes unrecoverable. That is as far as the evidence lets us walk. It is enough, and it is also not enough. The old reports sometimes feel formal, but feeling presses through them. Official language has a way of holding sorrow at arm's length. It says missing, presumed, concluded, probable. It does not say how the empty rooms felt to the man who found them. It does not say how the news sounded when it reached families. It does not say whether another keeper, years later, paused at the West Landing and thought of the 3 men before checking a rope. But those human echoes are not hard to imagine. We should be careful, even with imagination though. It should soften the file, not overwrite it. We imagine textures, rooms, weather, and the slow habits of work because they help us remain close to the real setting. We do not imagine final words or hidden motives. That is the boundary. In the Flannan case, kindness means refusing to take possession of the men's last thoughts. They are beyond us. We can honor the work they did, the names they carried, and the uncertainty that followed them, without pretending to enter their minds. The longer you sit with the case, the more it teaches restraint. At first, the empty lighthouse seems to ask for a dramatic answer. Later, it asks for a disciplined one. Later still, it asks only to be remembered accurately. That progression is part of why the mystery endures in thoughtful circles. It is not only a puzzle, it is a lesson in evidence, environment, and the slow transformation of fact into folklore. You can feel the lamplight on the page, and the lesson comes quietly. There were other lighthouse accidents in history, other losses at sea, and other remote postings where weather made ordinary labor dangerous. The Flannan case stands out because of its completeness. 3 men gone together, with no recovered bodies and no witness, but it also belongs to that wider world of maritime risk. Placing it there helps calm the strangeness without dismissing it. You can see the case not as an isolated impossibility, but as an unusually clean break in a dangerous pattern of work. That may be less sensational, but it is more humane. The word lighthouse can mislead us a little. It suggests safety. From a distance, a light in darkness feels protective, almost gentle. But for the keeper, the lighthouse stood at the edge of danger by design. It had to be where ships needed warning. It had to face the hardest weather. Its usefulness came from exposure. The Flannan Lighthouse was not a refuge set back from the sea. It was part of a system built close to risk, maintained by men who accepted that closeness as work. That exposure also meant that damage was not unusual in itself. A storm could affect landing stages, cranes, ropes, and storage. Keepers would be expected to inspect and report such things because the station depended on them. If gear was lost, future landings could become harder. If a crane was damaged, supplies could be difficult to handle. These practical concerns may have pulled the men outside. You can understand that pull. It is the pull of responsibility, the sense that a problem should be dealt with before it grows. Responsibility is not always dramatic. Often it is quiet and repetitive. It is checking a rope because you checked it yesterday. It is writing down weather because someone far away needs to know. It is stepping into cold air because equipment matters. In the Flannan case, responsibility may have placed the men near the West Landing at the wrong moment. If so, the tragedy lies not in mystery alone, but in devotion to routine. That is a softer and heavier thought than many legends allow. The coldness of the case, then, comes partly from the dignity of its likely explanation. There is no villain to name, no hidden plan to uncover, no secret code that will unlock the rooms. There is only work, weather, and the absence of a witness. For some listeners, that may feel unsatisfying. For us tonight, it can feel honest. Not every mystery has a dramatic center. Some have an empty center, shaped by all the things that could not be preserved. If you look again at the timeline, you can sense how quickly the chance for certainty narrowed. The light was reported out. Weather delayed relief. The landing came days later. The search found no men. The official inspection identified a likely accident scene. After that, each passing week made physical discovery less likely. The sea moved on. Winter continued. The lighthouse service adjusted. The story began its second life. You can almost feel the timeline cooling beneath your hand, date by date, until it becomes history. History has its own sounds. The scratch of a pen, the crackle of a newspaper page, a drawer sliding open in an office, rain against a reading room window. These sounds are quieter than the sea, but they are where the case has lived for most of its life. For more than a century, people have returned not to the island itself, but to descriptions of it. They have stood in paper rooms, listening for an answer the rocks did not give. You are there now, in that long line of readers, and as you read, you may notice that the strongest version of the Flannan case is not the strangest version. It is the one that leaves the men human, the weather real, and the evidence limited. It allows the lighthouse to be both ordinary and haunting. Because ordinary things become haunting when they stop in the middle. A coat not worn, a duty not completed, a boat not met, a light not seen. These details do not need embellishment. They are quiet enough to last. The next layer of the file brings us to the way later investigators and writers tried to reopen the old rooms, not physically at first, but by comparing accounts line by line. They asked what the Hesperus crew actually saw, what Moore reported, what Muirhead recorded, and what later newspapers added. This is patient detective work in its archival form. No waves strike the desk. No lantern needs trimming. But the work has its own atmosphere. Pencil marks, cross-references, dates written in margins, and the slow satisfaction of separating a primary source from a rumor. Primary sources have a plainness that can feel almost disappointing after legend. They rarely tremble. They do not arrange themselves for drama. They say what was found and what was concluded, often with spare language. Yet that plainness is valuable. It is the floor under the case. In the Flannan file, the floor is not wide, but it is sturdy enough to stand on. When you place your feet there, many elaborate theories become less necessary. The central mystery remains, but its shape becomes more natural. Natural does not mean easy. A probable sea accident is still difficult to imagine fully, because it may have happened in a matter of seconds, without warning and without later proof. The mind wants to slow it down, to see each man, each movement, each choice. The file will not allow that. It gives us conditions, not a scene. It gives us aftermath, not the moment. You can feel the restraint again, like a hand resting lightly on the page, keeping us from leaning too far forward. When stories add dramatic log entries, They may be trying to create the missing scene. They give the men fear, anticipation, or dread, as if the lighthouse itself sensed what was coming. But real life often does not warn us in literary ways. Work continues until it cannot. Men eat, write, mend, climb, and check. Weather worsens or improves. A decision is made because it seems practical. Then the record stops. The absence of drama before a loss can be one of its most unsettling truths, and also one of its most common. For a sleep narration, we approach that truth gently. We do not turn it into alarm. We let it become a meditation on limits. The men could not know they would become part of an old mystery. Moore could not know his walk into the lighthouse would be retold for generations. Muirhead could not know that his practical report would sit beside poems and rumors in public memory. Each person moved through his own present moment, while the future waited quietly out of sight. That is true of many human stories. The Flannan case also invites us to think about light as record. The lighthouse existed so that ships could mark their position against danger. When the light was out, it became a message, though not one anyone wanted. A missing signal turned into an investigation. You can imagine the unease of a captain or crew noticing darkness where a light should be, and then the slow process by which that observation reached people who could act. The absence of light became the first witness, but it could only say something was wrong. A witness like that is powerful and limited. It tells us the station was not functioning as expected by a certain time. It does not tell us why. It does not tell us whether the men were already gone, injured, delayed, or unable to tend the lamp. It does not identify the sequence. You see again how every clue in the Flannan case opens one door and leaves another closed. The dark light brings us to the threshold. The empty lighthouse takes us further. The west landing points outward. Then the sea begins. This is where the case's geography becomes almost a map of uncertainty. Inside the lighthouse, we have absence. On the path, we have possibility. At the landing, we have damage. Beyond the rocks, we have the ocean. And there the trail fades. You can move through those zones slowly, as if placing transparent sheets over one another. None gives the whole picture. Together, they suggest the probable form of events. But the final outline remains washed at the edges, like ink touched by water. The cold case units we think of today often rely on preserved evidence, new testing, and databases. The Flannan case offers almost none of that. Its evidence was environmental, observational, and perishable. Once the first inquiry ended, later generations could not swab the wave, photograph the exact weather, or interview the sea. They could only revisit documents and assess the strength of old reasoning. That gives the case a different kind of stillness. It is not waiting for technology in the usual way. It is waiting, perhaps forever, inside interpretation. Interpretation can still be worthwhile. It can correct errors. It can remove false details. It can restore context. It can remind us that a likely answer exists, even if a perfect answer does not. In the Flannan case, careful interpretation has helped distinguish the sober record from the more fanciful tradition. That is not a small service. It changes how we remember the men. It moves them from a haunted tableau back into the world of labor, weather, and duty. You can feel the kindness in that movement. The names matter each time we return. James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, Donald MacArthur. Saying them is a way of keeping the case grounded. Without names, the story becomes only the three lighthouse keepers, a phrase that sounds almost like a riddle. With names, it becomes three lives interrupted. You can imagine each name written in a roster, spoken by a supervisor, known by family, carried in letters, perhaps marked on pay records. The mystery belongs to them before it belongs to anyone else. Their work required both solitude and cooperation. A lighthouse station depended on men sharing confined space while maintaining exact routines. Too much isolation could wear on anyone, but the work also gave structure. Watches, maintenance, meals, cleaning, observation, and rest divided the day. You can picture the interior rhythms: a kettle set down, a page turned, a lamp checked, boots drying, a door latch lifted against wind. The Flannan Lighthouse was not empty by nature. It became empty, and that change is what the investigation kept trying to understand. The station's newness adds another quiet layer. The lighthouse had only been operating since the year before, so the routines were established, but not ancient. The building was part of a modernizing effort to make dangerous waters safer. It represented engineering, planning, and the promise that light could reduce loss. Then, almost at the beginning of its service life, it became associated with loss of its own. You can feel the sad irony, but we need not press it hard. It is simply there, written into the stones. Engineers and keepers often live at the meeting point of human design and natural force. A lighthouse is a confident structure, but its confidence is practical, not absolute. It can hold a lamp high, it can withstand weather, it can guide ships, but it cannot make the sea gentle, and it cannot protect every person who steps beyond its door. The Flannan case sits exactly at that meeting point. Human order inside, natural force outside, a brief crossing between them, and then unanswered questions. Over time, the unanswered questions became more famous than the probable answer. That happens because uncertainty is more memorable than likelihood. A phrase like "vanished from a lighthouse" travels farther than likely swept from rocks by a wave. The first phrase opens the imagination. The second asks us to sit with risk. Public memory often chooses the doorway that feels wider. Tonight, we can choose the narrower doorway because it leads closer to the men themselves and to the patient work done after they disappeared. Choosing that doorway does not remove mystery, it refines it. The mystery is not whether impossible forces entered the lighthouse. The mystery is exactly how 3 experienced or working keepers came to be in a position where the sea could take them, and why no recoverable trace remained. That is enough to hold the mind. It is also the kind of question investigators could approach, but not finish. You can feel the difference. It is a mystery of sequence, timing, and environment, not necessarily of motive. Motive is a word that belongs poorly here. In many cases, detectives look for who benefited, who lied, who feared discovery, who changed a story. In the Flannan case, motive gives way to circumstance. The likely actor is weather, and weather has no motive. It only acts. That makes the investigation both simpler and harder. Simpler because there is no complex human plot to untangle. Harder because weather leaves no confession, feels no guilt, and cannot be brought into a room and asked the same question twice. The old lighthouse records, in their plain way, show a world where people accepted that. They did not personify the sea when making reports. They measured, described, and concluded. Yet as listeners, we may still feel the sea as a presence, because it surrounds every part of the case. It delayed the Hesperus. It damaged the landing. It may have taken the men. It erased traces. It carried the story outward. You can hear it under every page. Not loud now, just steady, like breath through a sleeping house. A good detective learns to notice what does not change. Across versions, the legends shift, but certain facts remain. The island, the date range, the missing keepers, the unattended lighthouse, the damaged west landing, the official leaning toward a sea accident, no recovered bodies, no definitive witness. These are the stones that stay above the tide. When you feel uncertain, you can return to them. They do not solve everything, but they keep the mind from drifting too far into fog. The fog is not useless, though. It tells us something about ourselves. People kept retelling the Flannan case because they were moved by the image of order interrupted. They wanted the lighthouse to speak. They wanted the log to contain a warning. They wanted the room to hold a final gesture. That desire is deeply human. We do not have to scold it. We can understand it, and then set it gently aside when we read the evidence. Understanding the desire helps us resist being led by it. As night deepens around this telling, the pace of the investigation remains slow. There is no sudden clue waiting in the next paragraph. There is only a closer reading of what has always been there. The case went cold because its answer, if the strongest theory is right, happened outside the reach of record. The lighthouse preserved the before. The island preserved fragments of the after. The sea kept the during. You can hold those three parts in your mind, and the shape of the mystery becomes calm, though not complete. The before is the world of duty. Men living at a remote station, tending a light, recording conditions, sharing practical space. The after is Muir's arrival, the empty rooms, the search, Muirhead's inspection, and the report. The during is the missing passage. Many mysteries are built around a missing during. Detectives try to reconstruct it from before and after, and sometimes they succeed. Here, they could sketch it only broadly. That sketch has lasted because it fits, but the fine lines were washed away. You may notice that the Flannan case asks us to be comfortable with a probable answer. That is not always easy. We are trained by stories to expect a final key, a hidden compartment, a confession folded into an old book. Real investigations often end differently. They end with a balance of evidence, a professional judgment, and a small remaining ache. This case has lived with that ache for more than a century. It is part of why people still open the file. It is also why the file still feels quiet when they do. The quiet does not mean empty. It contains work. It contains the searchers who combed the island, the officials who wrote reports, the families who waited, the later researchers who corrected myths, and the readers who tried to hold all of it responsibly. When you imagine the file beside your lamp, you are joining that chain of attention. You do not have to solve the case tonight. No one has done that completely. You only have to read with care and let the old evidence remain itself. And when we move from the lighthouse rooms back outside once more, the West Landing waits in the same weathered place, holding the strongest clue and the deepest uncertainty together. You stand there in thought for a while, with the Flannan case spread around you as rock, wind, rope, and spray, and the landing becomes less like a clue in a story than a working place where men had to make decisions. The West Landing was not a neat platform in a calm harbor. It was an exposed edge, useful only when the sea allowed it, and dangerous when the sea changed its mind. You can picture iron fittings wet to the touch, ropes stiff with salt, and the rough drag of a boot sole over stone. A landing like that collected small responsibilities. Gear had to be checked, boxes had to be secured, ropes had to be kept from tangling or being lost. A crane or derrick could matter greatly when supplies came in, because a remote station depended on every practical arrangement remaining usable. If storm damage threatened the landing, it was not merely property at risk. It was the station's connection to relief, food, fuel, mail, and repair. You can feel why a keeper might look down toward damage and think, I should see to that now. That thought may have been enough. In old cases, the turning point is often not grand. It is a small decision made under ordinary pressure. You go to check a door. You cross a yard to bring something in. You step out to secure a rope before it is lost. On Eilean Moor, such a decision may have carried the men from the ordered interior of the Flannan Lighthouse into conditions that did not give them time to reconsider. The case went cold because the turning point was likely too small to leave a trace. If one man first went toward the West Landing, perhaps he expected only a brief task. You can imagine him pulling on outer clothing, or not quite pulling on enough, because the errand seemed close and familiar. The air outside would have been cold and wet, the kind of cold that reaches the wrist where a sleeve shifts. He may have walked with the practiced balance of someone who knew the path. The sea below would have been moving hard, but not every hard sea forbids every task. Experience teaches caution, but it can also teach confidence. If another man followed, the reason could have been simple help, a box too heavy, a rope fouled, a signal called back through wind, or merely the sight of a colleague working near a dangerous place. You and I do not need to choose one. The file does not choose for us. It lets the possibilities remain close together, like several penciled lines that nearly overlap. In the Flannan case, the difference between them may never be known, because all of them end at the same exposed edge. The third man is where many minds pause. Regulations suggested that one keeper should remain with the light, and that expectation has kept the question alive. But rules are lived by people in moments, not by ink alone. Perhaps the light was already tended for the hour. Perhaps the danger outside seemed immediate. Perhaps concern overcame habit. Perhaps the third man stepped out only briefly, intending to return at once. You sit with those possibilities as a careful detective would, seeing that none is certain and none is impossible. The missing oilskin, in some accounts, has been used to support the idea that one man left in haste. That may be so, though the detail must be handled with care. Clothing records and later descriptions are not always as clean as we would like. Still, as an image, it belongs to the practical world of the station. A heavy weather coat hanging in place, salt dried along its edge, sleeves cool, stiff, and faintly oily from use. If a man left without it, the reason might have been urgency, nearness, or the belief that he would be back in minutes. Minutes matter in this case. The long public mystery has lasted more than a century, but the central event, if it was a sea accident, may have unfolded in less time than it takes to read a page. That contrast gives the Flannan case its quiet ache. So much waiting afterward, so much writing, searching, retelling, and wondering. Yet the moment itself may have been brief, practical, and unrecorded. You can let that thought rest without forcing it into a scene. The file permits only the outline. The outline leads to the wave, or to the sudden sea, or to some combination of swell, rock, footing, and timing. A wave does not have to be mythic to be overwhelming. It only has to arrive when men are poorly placed. It only has to rise higher than expected, break with more force than the last several waves, and take advantage of a moment when attention is on gear, rope, or a colleague. You can hear the sound in a muted way, not as drama, but as weather, doing what weather does. Afterward, the island would not have looked instantly different from a distance. The lighthouse still stood. The light, depending on timing, might not yet have announced the trouble. The path remained. The landing remained. The sea withdrew, and another wave came after it, and then another. This is one of the hardest parts of the Flannan case to sit with gently. The world can continue its motions after a life-changing moment. The tide does not stop to mark the place. The wind does not lower its voice. Inside the lighthouse, the rooms would have waited. That word feels right, though rooms do not wait in any conscious way. They hold the shape of use until someone returns. A chair remains where it is. A bed stays folded or disturbed. A cup cools. A log lies closed or open. The smell of oil and coal and damp fabric remains in the air. You can imagine that stillness growing over hours, then days, while outside the sea kept working at the island and the relief vessel was held back by weather. It is this delay that gives the case its deep coldness. If someone had arrived within an hour, perhaps there would have been clearer signs. A fresh mark, a recently moved object, a more precise sense of whether the men had been at the landing together. But the Hesperus came days later, and days are long on an exposed island in winter. The weather had time to rearrange, soften, erase, and confuse. You can feel those days passing like pages. No one was there to turn. When Moore entered the lighthouse on the 26th, he was reading a scene already aged by absence. That matters. He was not stepping into a moment just left behind. No matter how later stories sometimes make it feel, he was stepping into a station that had been unattended for an uncertain period, with cold rooms and interrupted routines. The Flannan case went cold partly because the discovery was not immediate. Investigation often depends on freshness, and here freshness had been taken by sea, weather, and delay before the first human witness could begin. The official search extended beyond the rooms, of course. Men looked across the island, along the landings and near places where a fall or accident might have left traces. Their work would have been slow, physical, and exposed. You can picture them bent against wind, scanning rock and turf, perhaps calling out though they knew the chance was small. Salt would dry on their faces. Their hands would stiffen. Every hollow and edge would need attention. In that searching there is no thrill, only duty. Duty is a word that belongs everywhere in the Flannan case. The keepers had it. The relief crew had it. Moore had it when he climbed to the station. Muirhead had it when he inspected and reported. Later researchers had it in a different form when they tried to separate record from invention. Even we have a small version of it tonight, if we are going to sit with the story at all. Our duty is not to solve by force. It is to remain patient with what can and cannot be known. As the searchers found no bodies, the inquiry became more dependent on surroundings. The damaged West Landing became more significant because the men themselves were absent. Investigators had to ask what the island could say in their place. Broken or displaced equipment may show force. Missing items may suggest activity. The pattern of damage may point toward a recent storm. But each of these things speaks indirectly. You can feel the report trying to make a sentence from fragments. Weather, damage, duty, absence, sea. That sentence was persuasive enough to guide the official view. It was not persuasive enough to quiet every later imagination. This is a common tension in cold cases. The official answer may be the most reasonable one, yet it lacks the emotional completeness people seek. No one saw the wave. No one recovered the men. No one could say exactly who stepped where first. So the mind keeps returning, not because the official view is weak, but because the human need for a final image is strong. A final image is exactly what the case refuses. It gives us many images before and after, but not that one. We see the lighthouse from the relief vessel. We see Moore climbing. We see the rooms. We see the West Landing. We see Muirhead studying damage. But when we try to see the last shared moment of Ducat, Marshall, and MacArthur, the page turns pale. That blankness is not a clue to something impossible. It is the natural blankness of a loss unwitnessed and unrecorded. The names return again, and they should. James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, Donald MacArthur. You can place them gently in the working spaces of the station, one near the log, one at the lamp, one at the stove or stores, not frozen in those positions, not arranged for us, but present in the ordinary way men are present before a mystery overtakes their names. The Flannan case becomes calmer when we keep them alive in routine, because routine is the true setting from which they vanished. Routine also explains why the first concern may have been practical rather than fearful. If weather had damaged the West Landing, the keepers would think in terms of station maintenance. They would ask what needed securing, what might be lost, what could wait, and what might worsen. This is the thinking of workers responsible for an isolated site. It is not reckless by nature. It is grounded in the daily knowledge that small failures can become large problems. You can see how care itself might lead them outside. The island path would have been familiar, but familiarity is not safety. In rough weather, the same path changes. Stone becomes slick. Spray can blur sight. Wind alters balance. A sound from below can distract the ear. A man may turn to speak and misjudge the edge of force moving toward him. These are not extraordinary things. They are small vulnerabilities of bodies in weather. The Flannan case may have gone cold because the truth was made of such small vulnerabilities, none of which remained visible afterward. In a modern reconstruction, someone might model wave height, wind direction, and swell behavior around the landing. Such work could be interesting, but it would still rest on imperfect data. The exact sea state at the exact moment is gone. The precise positions of the men are gone. Even the specific task that drew them out is uncertain. You can see how later tools meet old limits. They may sharpen our sense of plausibility, but they cannot restore the lost seconds. The coldness remains, not from neglect, but from absence. Absence is the case's central material. It is almost something you can touch. No men at the landing, no men inside, no bodies recovered, no final written line, no witness, no contradiction strong enough to overturn the sea explanation, no proof strong enough to make the sea explanation complete. You hold all those absences together, and they form the shape people call mystery. Yet each absence is also simple. Each one is a place where evidence did not survive. The later myths often try to turn absence into presence. They add strange emotions, strange entries, strange objects, as if the case cannot be allowed to remain plain. But the plain version has its own depth. The plain version asks us to consider how little may separate a normal working day from an unresolved file. It asks us to think about weather, communication, and the vulnerability of people doing necessary work in remote places. It asks us to listen to quiet facts. That is more than enough for tonight. From the West Landing, the file moves back into official language, and the tone changes. A report cannot linger on atmosphere. It has to state findings. It has to give superiors a basis for understanding. Muirhead's conclusion, that the men were likely swept away by the sea, came from this sober purpose. You can imagine the care needed to write such a thing. Too much certainty would be unfair. Too much hesitation would leave the board without guidance. The language had to stand in the middle, where evidence stood. That middle place is where thoughtful readers still stand. We can say the storm damage theory is the strongest. We can say the men were probably lost to the sea near the West Landing. We can say later embellishments should be treated cautiously, but we cannot say we know exactly how the final moments unfolded. This is not a failure of imagination. It is respect for the boundary of the record. In cold case work, the boundary is as important as the clue. You can feel the boundary in the lighthouse rooms. Imagine opening a cupboard, touching a ledger, looking at the lamp apparatus, and knowing that none of it will answer the last question. The objects are close to the men, but not close enough. They speak of occupation, not disappearance. A bed tells you someone slept there. A log tells you someone wrote there. A stove tells you someone cooked there. But none can say why no one came down to meet the Hesperus. The lighthouse holds context, not confession. The Hesperus itself deserves a moment of quiet attention. A relief vessel is a line between isolation and the wider world. It brings food, mail, replacement men, conversation, and news. For those aboard, the arrival at a station usually followed a known rhythm: signals, landing, greetings, transfer of stores, exchange of reports. On the 26th of December, that rhythm failed. You can imagine the vessel lying near the island, the crew looking for movement, the air sharp with salt, and the first understanding that something was wrong settling slowly, rather than suddenly. Settling slowly is often how knowledge arrives in real life. Not as a single thunderclap, but as several small confirmations. No signal, no man on the path, no answer. The relief keeper goes up, the rooms are empty, the island search begins. Each step removes one ordinary explanation. Perhaps they are elsewhere. Perhaps someone is ill. Perhaps there has been a misunderstanding. One by one, those possibilities fall away. What remains is absence, and absence must be reported. Reporting absence is difficult because it sounds less complete than reporting an event. The men were not there. They could not be found. The light had been unattended. The station was in a certain condition. The landing showed damage. From these, an event is inferred. You can see why the case left room for later speculation. Inference is necessary, but it has seams. People return to those seams and ask whether another story might fit. Sometimes they ask wisely. Sometimes they ask because mystery has become more attractive than evidence. In the Flannan case, wise questions remain valuable. They include the timing of the light's failure, the order in which the men may have left the building, the exact weather conditions, the interpretation of damage, and the reliability of later claims. These questions do not overturn the likely explanation. They refine our humility. You can hold them like small stones in your palm, feeling their weight without throwing them through the window of the record. Questions can be gentle. They do not have to be accusations. Accusation has never served this case well. When people speculate darkly about the men's relationships, they often move beyond evidence and into projection. Isolation can strain people, but strain is not proof. A remote station can host disagreements, but disagreement is not disappearance. Without solid signs, it is kinder and more rigorous to avoid placing blame among men who cannot answer. You and I can return instead to the documented conditions, where the evidence is quieter but firmer beneath our feet. The documentary mind asks what is simplest, what is supported, what accounts for the most facts with the fewest inventions. The sea accident theory does that. It accounts for the damaged landing, the missing men, the lack of bodies, and the absence of clear signs of human wrongdoing. It does not answer every detail, because no theory can restore every lost minute. But a good explanation does not need to be decorative. It needs to be proportionate. In the Flannan case, proportion points toward weather and work. Still, proportion is not poetry, and perhaps that is why poetry took hold. The island seems made for metaphor. A lonely light, an empty station, 3 men gone into winter, the Atlantic around everything. These images invite language that goes beyond the report. We can allow the invitation without mistaking it for evidence. You may feel the poetry of the place as we continue, but the detective beside you keeps a finger on the page, reminding you where the facts are written and where the mist begins. The mist begins wherever a detail appears first in a later retelling and then travels backward, as if it had always been there. That is one of the archive's quiet lessons. You learn not only to read, but to date your reading. When did this claim first appear? Who repeated it? Did it come from someone who had access to the original inquiry, or from someone shaping a mood? In the Flannan case, that work matters, because the most famous details are not always the strongest ones. The older paper is plainer and more useful. Useful plainness can be beautiful in its own way. A measured note about damage near a landing may not stir the imagination like a strange logbook entry, but it belongs to the real investigation. It points to men moving through a real environment. It gives the sea a practical role. It helps us understand why trained officials reached the conclusion they did. As you read such a note, you can almost smell wet rope and rust, and hear the dull knock of equipment shifted by weather. The senses keep us close to the case without inventing facts. The archive smells of paper, but the island smells of salt, peat, oil, iron, and cold stone. The lighthouse sounds like wind against masonry, boots on steps, and the muted work of a maintained lamp. The landing feels rough, slick, and exposed. A coat feels heavy when damp. A rope feels abrasive even through gloves. These details do not solve the mystery, but they give the known world its body. They prevent the case from becoming only an idea. When a case becomes only an idea, people can move pieces too freely. They can make the men behave as symbols, make the lighthouse a stage, make the sea a villain, and make uncertainty a puzzle designed for entertainment. We are avoiding that. We keep the world physical. We keep the men working. We keep the evidence modest. The Flannan case does not need to be solved tonight to be treated well. It needs to be held at the right distance, close enough for compassion and far enough for honesty. There is a quiet comfort in that distance. You are not on the rocks. You are at the desk, reading by lamplight, letting the old file breathe. The storm has passed into history. The island is beyond the window only in thought. The men are beyond our reach, but not beyond remembrance. You can slow your breathing as the page turns. The case remains patient. It has waited through many nights, and it asks nothing hurried from you now. When we consider why it went cold, we also consider the era's communication. A remote lighthouse in 1900 was not monitored in the continuous way a modern facility might be. Silence could last without immediate alarm, especially when weather disrupted schedules. A missed light might be noticed, reported, and acted upon, but action still depended on ships, messages, and sea conditions. You can feel how each step added time. Time allowed uncertainty to harden. By the time help arrived, the case was already moving from emergency into investigation. The distinction is important. Emergency seeks rescue. Investigation seeks explanation. In the Flannan case, those phases nearly overlapped, but the delay meant the hope of rescue was already thin when the search began. The men were missing, the station was empty, and the conditions suggested loss. Investigators still searched because duty required it, and because no decent person gives up without looking. But the file's emotional temperature had changed. It had become a search not only for men, but for the meaning of their absence. Meaning can be a dangerous word in an investigation. It tempts us to make events teach a lesson they did not intend. But there is a modest kind of meaning that comes from understanding conditions. The Flannan case teaches us about exposure, isolation, the limits of record, and the way routine can intersect with danger. It also teaches us how legends grow around gaps. These are not lessons imposed on the men. They are lessons drawn from the file itself, from the way evidence remains and fails to remain. The cold case did not freeze in one night. It cooled in stages. First came the absence, then the search, then the official conclusion, then the lack of new evidence, then the retellings, each adding distance from the original event, then the later corrections, which warmed the documentary core again by clearing away some mist. You can feel these stages as a slow change in air, like a room cooling after the fire has gone low. Nothing sudden, only gradual settling. Gradual settling is the right pace for this story. The Flannan case has often been told with a sharper edge, but the evidence itself is not sharp in that way. It is weathered. Its corners are worn. Its main objects are paper, stone, cloth, rope, and light. You can place each one in front of you calmly. Paper for the record, stone for the island, cloth for the missing oilskins and working clothes, rope for the landing, light for the duty that failed and revealed the loss. Light is perhaps the gentlest object in the case, though its absence began the alarm. A lighthouse beam is repetitive by nature. It turns or flashes according to pattern, asking to be noticed only so that danger can be avoided. For ships, that pattern meant orientation. For investigators, the broken pattern meant trouble. You can imagine a distant observer seeing darkness where rhythm should be, and feeling the first small unease. Not panic, just a question. Then the question traveled onward, gathering weight. Questions travel strangely in old cases. They move from witness to official, from official to report, from report to newspaper, from newspaper to memory, and from memory to folklore. Each transfer can preserve or distort. The Flannan question traveled for years until it became larger than the original inquiry. Why were the men gone? Why was the lighthouse empty? Why did no one see? Why did the sea give nothing back? You can hear those questions soften as they repeat, less like interrogation now, more like waves returning to the same shore. The shore, if we can call the island's hard edges that, did not answer. Searchers found no hidden refuge, no injured men, no sign that they had taken a boat and left. The practical conclusion remained. The west landing and sea conditions explained more than any other theory. This is where the case's patience asks us to accept that a lack of exotic evidence is not itself suspicious. Sometimes nothing strange is found because nothing strange happened. Sometimes the ordinary danger is enough. Ordinary danger is difficult to honor because it lacks a face. We remember names better than forces. We remember villains better than weather. But lighthouse work existed precisely because weather and rock were dangerous without intention. The Flannan men lived in service to that fact. If the sea took them while they tended the station, then the same force they helped others avoid became the force that hid their ending. That is a solemn thought, and it does not need to be sharpened further. A century later, people still visit or write about the island, and the story still gathers attention. But attention is not the same as progress. In many cold cases, renewed attention brings leads. Here, renewed attention most often brings renewed interpretation. The evidence pool has not expanded much. The original conditions cannot be recreated fully. The men cannot be found through modern identity work if there are no remains to examine. You can see how the case remains open and feeling, even while its practical possibilities are limited. That limitation can be peaceful, in a way. It frees us from chasing false certainty. We can spend our time understanding rather than conquering. You can look at the Flannan case as an old room where everything has been arranged as carefully as possible, and still one window looks out onto blank sea. We do not have to cover that window. We can let it remain with night beyond it and the faint salt mark on the glass. The men who served afterward at the lighthouse had to live with that window in a literal sense. They worked in the same rooms, or rooms much like them, and looked toward the same landings. The disappearance became part of the station's atmosphere, even if daily work kept it from dominating every hour. A keeper cannot spend all his time thinking about a previous loss. The lamp must be tended, supplies must be handled, meals must be made. Still, the story would have been there, a quiet presence behind routine. Routine after loss is one of the most human parts of any investigation. The world requires continuation. Reports are filed, replacements arrive, equipment is repaired, families mourn, work resumes. The resumption can seem harsh, but it is also how institutions keep faith with purpose. The light had to shine because ships still passed the Flannans. You can feel the weight of that continuity. The same tower that could not explain the disappearance continued saving others from the rocks. Its service did not erase the mystery, but it gave the building back some of its original meaning. As you sit with this, the case becomes less like a sealed riddle and more like a layered memory. One layer is the immediate event, incomplete and weathered. Another is the official inquiry, practical and restrained. Another is public legend, atmospheric and sometimes unreliable. Another is modern correction, patient and archival. We move among these layers carefully, always returning to the names and the island. The Flannan case survives because all these layers remain, but its dignity depends on knowing which layer we are touching. Tonight, we are touching the official and human layers most often. We let the legend hum softly in the background, but we do not let it lead. The lighthouse does not need to be haunted to be moving. It only needs to be empty when it should not be. The sea does not need to be supernatural to be powerful. It only needs to be winter sea against exposed rock. The men do not need invented fear to be remembered. They only need their names spoken with care. Care also means acknowledging uncertainty without making it larger for effect. The exact date of the disappearance is not absolutely fixed in the way a witnessed event would be. The 15th is important because of the light report, but the broader gap remains part of the difficulty. The condition of the lighthouse was observed after days had passed. Some details popular in later accounts are doubtful. These are sober statements. They do not drain the story, they give it a truer shape, and a true shape is easier to rest beside. Rest is part of why we tell it this way. A mystery can keep the mind awake if it is sharpened into danger, but it can also quiet the mind if it is paced as patient attention. You are not being asked to solve what generations could not fully solve. You are simply watching how careful people tried. You see the relief vessel approach. You see Moore climb. You see Muirhead inspect. You see later readers compare accounts. Each action is steady. Each belongs to the long, slow work of understanding. Understanding may stop short of certainty, but it still matters. It prevents wild accusation. It corrects false details. It honors working lives. It reminds us that cold cases are not games, even when they become famous mysteries. The Flannan case is often introduced with its strangeness, yet its deeper lesson may be its ordinariness. Men at work, weather changing, communication delayed, evidence erased. That ordinariness does not make it less sad. It makes it closer to the real world, where many important things happen without witnesses. The archive does not mind our quiet. It is used to silence. You can imagine closing one folder and opening another, the cardboard soft at the corners, the pages smelling faintly of dust and time. A notation catches your eye. A date appears again. A name repeats. The rhythm of reading becomes almost like the rhythm of the light itself, returning, pausing, returning. The case does not move forward in the way a new investigation might, but your understanding deepens by small degrees. Small degrees are enough. You learn that the famous strange log was likely not part of the real record. You learn that the most dramatic kitchen details are uncertain. You learn that the West Landing mattered more than many tellings admit. You learn that the official explanation was not careless dismissal, but a reasoned conclusion from a man familiar with Lighthouse service. You learn that absence can be evidence and also limitation. These lessons arrive slowly, like dawn coming through a misted window. Dawn on Eilean Moor would have shown the same hard shapes after the men were gone. Rock, tower, grass, sea. The island did not visually confess. That is worth remembering. A place can be central to a mystery and still reveal very little. Investigators often hope a scene will speak, but scenes speak in fragments. A scuffed surface here, a broken fitting there, a missing object, a pattern of damage. The Flannan scene spoke enough to suggest the sea, not enough to close the book. Closing the book too firmly would be untrue. Leaving it wildly open would also be untrue, so we keep it half open, as the evidence does. This is the posture of many old mysteries handled well. The mind rests between probability and humility. You can feel that posture in your own body now, perhaps shoulders lowering, attention softening, the case no longer demanding an answer but offering a long example of patient limits. The lighthouse remains in view, but its light is gentler from here. From this gentler distance, the men's work becomes clearer. The keepers maintained a beam for strangers they would never meet. Ships passed in darkness and took bearings from their labor. That kind of service is quiet by nature. It is noticed most when it fails. The Flannan case began as such a failure, not moral failure, but operational absence. The light was not seen. The rhythm had stopped. The world looked toward the lighthouse because the lighthouse had ceased doing what everyone trusted it to do. Trust is central to lighthouse life. Mariners trusted the light. The board trusted the keepers. The keepers trusted routine, equipment, and one another. Families trusted schedules of relief and return. The disappearance broke many kinds of trust at once, though perhaps through no one's fault. Weather can break trust without intending to. It can make schedules meaningless, paths unsafe, and evidence unreadable. You can sense that broken trust in the way the case lingered. People did not simply want to know what happened. They wanted the world to feel orderly again. The official report tried to restore order through reason. It gathered the known facts and placed them into the most probable arrangement. That is what reports do. They cannot restore lives, but they can prevent confusion from spreading without limit. In the Flannan case, reason pointed to the sea. The later legend pointed everywhere. We are choosing reason, but gently, because reason here is not triumphant. It is modest. It says, "This is most likely," while leaving its hat in its hands before what cannot be known. That modesty is why the case remains suitable for slow thought. It does not ask us to chase a suspect down a street. It asks us to sit with a limit. It asks whether careful reconstruction can be enough when certainty is gone. It asks how we remember people when the last page of their story is missing. These are quiet questions, and they belong to the late hour. You can let them move through the room like low light, not disturbing anything, only making familiar shapes visible. The case file, in this imagined room, has grown thicker with our attention, not because new evidence has appeared, but because each known detail has gained context. The West Landing is no longer just a location. It is a practical connection to supplies and relief. The missing light is no longer just an eerie sign. It is a functional failure noticed by those who depended on it. The empty rooms are no longer only atmospheric. They are the interior half of an event whose exterior half may have been erased by the sea. Erasure is a word we should use carefully. The sea did not erase in a deliberate sense, but the effect was the same. It removed bodies, softened traces, and complicated timing. It made the investigation rely on what remained on land. That is why the lighthouse felt so important. It was the part of the scene still available. Investigators could enter it, touch it, inventory it, and report on it. But the decisive space may have been outside, at the boundary where land met water. Boundaries are often dangerous in cases like this. Doorways, thresholds, shorelines, stairwells, crossings, places where one condition becomes another. The Flannan men may have crossed from shelter to exposure, from duty to risk, from routine to accident. The precise boundary cannot be marked, but the idea helps us understand the case. The lighthouse did not contain the whole answer. It contained the last stable world before the answer. That is why it went cold there. The warmth of human routine ended at the door, and the rest belonged to weather. Still, the lighthouse gave investigators an anchor. Without it, the disappearance would have been even more difficult. The condition of the station showed the men had not simply continued ordinary work. The unattended light showed interruption. The absence of obvious disorder inside made certain theories less likely. The remaining clothing and equipment raised questions about haste and movement. You can see how even limited evidence can guide thought. The building did not solve the case, but it narrowed the room in which reasonable explanations could stand. Reasonable explanations can be lonely. They do not always satisfy an audience looking for wonder, but for the families and for the service, a reasonable explanation may have been a form of mercy, even if incomplete. It gave the loss a likely shape. It placed responsibility in the environment rather than in malice. It allowed practical lessons to be drawn. You can imagine that some people accepted it, some struggled with it, and some moved between acceptance and doubt depending on the day. Human grief often does that. Doubt is not always opposition to truth. Sometimes it is the mind's way of staying near someone missing. If the answer is not final, then the person feels not entirely gone from the question. That is one reason unresolved cases endure so powerfully in families and communities. The Flannan case, though old now, would have begun with very personal doubt. Could they somehow be alive? Could they have reached another place? Could there have been a mistake? The investigation narrowed those hopes, but narrowing is not the same as healing. The coldness of a case can therefore be felt differently by different people. To an official, it may mean no further leads. To a researcher, it may mean no new documents. To the public, it may mean enduring mystery. To a family, it may mean a question that never became a farewell. When we say the Flannan case went cold, we should hear all those meanings softly overlapping. The lighthouse was a workplace, an evidence scene, a symbol, and for some, the last known place connected to someone loved. Place has memory, because people give it memory. Eilean Moore did not ask to become famous. It was rock, grass, weather, birds, and a tower. But after the disappearance, every description of it carried human meaning. The West Landing became more than a landing. The tower became more than a tower. The empty rooms became more than rooms. You can feel the transformation happening across time, as if each retelling placed another thin layer of paper over the island, until the original contours were still there but harder to see. Our work is to trace the contours through the layers, the island's remoteness, the winter weather, the delayed relief, the absent men, the damaged landing, the official conclusion, the later legends, the modern corrections. Each contour matters. If you press too hard on one, the others distort. A patient detective uses a lighter hand. You let each fact settle beside the next. You do not force them into a shape sharper than they naturally make. The resulting picture is a little blurred, but it is honest. Honesty can be soothing because it stops the mind from chasing false doors. We do not need to run after every rumor. We can note it, weigh it, and set it aside when it lacks support. We do not need to invent a final scene. We can sit with the probable outline. We do not need to pretend that every question has equal force. Some questions are central, and some are born from later embroidery. In the Flannan case, this sorting is the quietest and most useful kind of detective work. The sorting continues whenever someone asks about the logbook. The real log, as far as careful accounts can tell us, did not contain the famous dramatic sequence often repeated in popular versions. That matters because the invented or doubtful entries changed the case's emotional weather. They suggested foreknowledge, distress, and unnatural conditions. Without them, the case becomes less gothic and more practical. It returns to a remote station facing severe weather and a likely accident. You can feel the air clear a little when those doubtful words are removed. Cleared air does not remove sadness. It lets sadness stand in daylight. The men did not need to be surrounded by ominous writing to be mourned. Their disappearance is sad because they were people, because they were at work, because they did not return, and because those who cared for them did not receive certainty. That is enough. The Flannan case is not diminished when stripped of embellishment. It becomes more respectful, and in that respect there is a deeper quiet. The kitchen details, too, become less central when treated carefully. Whether a meal was left in a particular state is far less important than the larger pattern of interruption. The station was not operating normally. The men were gone. Something had drawn or forced them away from the expected rhythm. You can imagine the kitchen without relying on a perfect tableau. Ordinary utensils, stored provisions, a surface wiped or unwiped, the faint smell of cold ash, a room that had once held conversation and now held only air. That is enough to feel the absence. Absence in a domestic room can affect us more than damage outside, because it resembles our own lives. We know tables, chairs, cups, coats, and beds. We may not know lighthouse landings or Atlantic swells, but we know what it means for a room to wait for someone. That recognition helped the story travel. People far from Scotland could imagine an empty kitchen. They could imagine a lamp left untended. They could imagine a relief keeper opening a door. The case became intimate because its clues were partly domestic, and yet the cause, most likely, was not domestic. It was outside. This movement from intimate rooms to indifferent weather is one of the case's quiet tensions. You begin in a human space and are led toward the sea, where human categories weaken. The file asks you to cross that distance again and again. Inside, there are names and routines. Outside, there are waves and rock. The disappearance seems to have happened where those two worlds met, which is why neither world alone can fully explain it. The lighthouse steps connect them. Think of those steps as a spine through the case. Men climbed them to tend the light. More climbed toward the empty station. Investigators moved through them while searching. Later, imagination climbs them too, each time returning to the lantern and the rooms below. The steps would have held the sound of work, and then the sound of inspection. They are not a clue in themselves, but they are part of the building's memory. You can hear boots on them, slow and hollow. Hollow sounds belong to empty buildings, and the lighthouse after the disappearance must have had many. A door closing with no voices after it. A footfall in a passage where men usually answered one another. Wind pressing against glass. The small echo inside the tower. These impressions may not appear in the official report, but they help us understand why Moore's experience became central to the story. He encountered not only missing men, but the sound of a living workplace deprived of its life. The official mind must move from feeling to finding. Moore's impressions mattered, but they had to be translated into observations. What was in place? What was missing? What was damaged? What duties had not been performed? What did the exterior show? This translation is the heart of investigation. It turns unease into questions that can be examined. In the Flannan case, the translation produced a probable answer, but the original unease remained available to every later storyteller. Unease is not evidence, though it can point toward evidence. That distinction is worth holding. When something feels wrong, investigators look for why. But if the why turns out to be absence, delay, and environmental risk, the feeling should not be allowed to create additional facts. You and I can honor the unease of the empty lighthouse while still staying close to the report. We can say, yes, this must have felt strange, and then we can ask, what did careful observers actually find? They found a station without its keepers. They found signs pointing outward. They found damage consistent with severe weather. They did not find proof of a quarrel, escape, or elaborate mystery. This does not make the case simple, because a probable sea accident involving 3 men still leaves serious questions. But it does make the wilder theories less necessary. You can let them fade into the background, like voices in another room, while the main file remains open under the lamp. The lamp in your room, imagined or real, is different from the lantern in the tower, but both make small circles of attention. Within the circle, details become visible. Beyond it, darkness remains. This is a fitting way to hold the Flannan case. We illuminate what the record supports. We accept that beyond the circle, the sea keeps its darkness. There is no shame in that. A careful investigator does not pretend the lamp reaches farther than it does. As the night continues, we return to patience. Patience with old handwriting, patience with uncertain dates, patience with human memory, patience with official restraint, patience with the public's need for story, patience with our own wish for a final answer. Each form of patience softens the case without dulling it. The Flannan mystery remains, but it no longer presses sharply against the mind. It becomes something we can sit beside, like a closed window with rain on the other side. Rain may have fallen on the island during those days, or spray may have been enough to wet every surface. Either way, dampness belongs to the atmosphere. Damp stone, damp wool, damp rope, damp paper if handled carelessly near an open door. Moisture changes how a place feels. It adds weight, it lowers sound. It makes metal colder and cloth heavier. In thinking about the Flannan Lighthouse, these small physical truths keep us anchored. They remind us that the case did not happen in an abstract mystery space, but in weather. Weather also shaped emotion. A delayed boat is not only a logistical fact, it is an emotional one. Men waiting for relief may feel impatience or resignation. Men aboard the relief vessel may feel frustration at being held back. Families waiting elsewhere may not yet know anything is wrong. After the disappearance, each delay could be reread with pain. If only the sea had allowed an earlier landing. If only the light's absence had brought faster action. These thoughts are natural, but they do not change the conditions. They only show how time becomes heavy afterward. Time is one of the quiet characters in the Flannan case. The days before discovery. The minutes of the unknown event. The hours the lighthouse stood empty. The years of retelling. The century of uncertainty. Time does different things at each scale. Minutes hide the event. Days erase evidence. Years grow legend. Decades invite re-examination. As you sit with the file, you can feel all those scales together, layered like thin sheets of tracing paper over the island. Tracing paper is a useful image because the underlying lines never fully disappear, but they can become blurred by what is placed above them. The original lines are plain enough. Missing keepers, empty station, damaged landing, likely sea accident. Later lines add mood, speculation, and invention. Modern lines try to clarify again. Our reading tonight follows the underlying lines as carefully as possible, while acknowledging that some blurring is now part of the case's history. The Flannan mystery is both an event and the story of how an event is remembered. Remembering responsibly means returning to the men's ordinariness. James Ducat had a role, experience, and responsibilities. Thomas Marshall had his own place in the station's working order. Donald MacArthur was not merely the third figure in a mystery, but a man doing a difficult posting. Their names deserve more than being arranged around an eerie premise. You can imagine them in lamplight, not ghostly, but tired, practical, perhaps speaking of weather, relief, food, equipment, or home. Those ordinary subjects are where real lives usually reside. Home is mostly outside the file, but it hovers there. Lighthouse keepers often lived between home and station, between family life and isolated duty. Relief schedules mattered because they marked return. A delay could mean disappointment even before it meant danger. Letters might wait, news might arrive late. The Flannan disappearance severed those expected returns. You can sense the quiet harm of that, the way a timetable becomes a grief document when someone never comes back to fulfill it. The official documents may not dwell on grief, but they are shaped by it, indirectly. Institutions record loss because people must be informed, employment matters settled, safety considered, and responsibility examined. The language may seem dry, but dryness can be a way of holding difficult things steady. In the Flannan case, the report's restraint is not a lack of feeling. It is the form feeling takes when it must become useful. You can read it with that in mind, hearing the human concern under the formal surface. Formal surfaces are common in old records. They protect the writer and the reader from being overwhelmed. A phrase like probable accident can sit on a page more easily than the full imaginative weight of 3 men lost to winter sea. But the weight is still there. You feel it when the names appear. You feel it when the relief vessel arrives to silence. You feel it when the search returns nothing. The file never says everything it contains. That is why quiet reading matters. Quiet reading also reveals what is not there. No definitive last entry. No trustworthy witness of a quarrel. No evidence of planned disappearance. No recovered remains. No later discovery that overturned the official view. These absences are not dramatic when listed in a report, but together they shape the case's limits. You can see why it stayed cold. There was simply nowhere firm for the investigation to go after the island, the rooms, and the landing had been examined. Some cold cases grow warmer when old evidence meets new science. This one mostly resists that path, unless the sea were to return something identifiable or a previously unknown primary record were to emerge. The central facts are unlikely to change greatly. That does not make continued discussion pointless. It makes careful discussion more important. When new proof is unlikely, accuracy in retelling becomes the main form of respect. You and I can practice that respect by refusing to let the more colorful claims become the core. The core is quieter. A lighthouse in winter. 3 men at work. A light reported out. A relief vessel delayed. An empty station. Damage near a landing. A probable sea accident. No final certainty. Those few lines hold the case more honestly than a dozen ornaments. They are enough to keep a listener company through the late hours, because they leave space for thought rather than forcing excitement. The Flannan case, held this way, becomes a meditation on how much can be lost between one visit and the next. Between visits is where many remote mysteries live. Someone is seen or known to be safe at one point, then found absent at another. The interval becomes the mystery. Investigators try to shrink it, fill it, and understand it. Here, the interval was widened by weather and communication. The keepers were expected to maintain their post. Then, when the relief came, they were gone. In between lies the unknown. You can feel that interval, like a dim hallway, quiet and closed at the far end. We do not need to force open the far door tonight. Instead, we can sit near it and study the handle, the frame, the dust on the floor, the draft beneath it. That is what patient investigation does when the door will not open. It learns everything around the unknown. In the Flannan case, everything around the unknown points us back to the landing and the sea. The answer may be just beyond that door, but the shape of its shadow is visible enough to guide us. The shadow is not supernatural. It is the shadow of weather. It falls across the path, the landing, the damaged gear, and the delayed relief. It falls across the official report and the later myths. It falls across the way we imagine the lighthouse at night. Yet within that shadow, there is also light, because the evidence gives us a probable direction. We are not lost. We are simply stopped before the final detail. That distinction is gentle, but important. If you were the detective in charge of revisiting the case now, your work would be mostly archival. You would gather the earliest reports. You would compare versions. You would map the island and landings. You would read Muirhead's findings closely. You would examine claims about the logbook and kitchen. You would separate primary evidence from later atmosphere. At the end of that work, you might not have a new solution, but you would have a cleaner case. Sometimes that is the best cold case work can do. A cleaner case is a gift to memory. It allows future listeners to meet the event without being crowded by errors. It lets the men stand nearer to their real lives. It lets the lighthouse remain a workplace, not merely a haunted symbol. It lets the sea be dangerous without being magical. It lets uncertainty be precise. The Flannan case deserves that precision, especially because its public image has so often been shaped by beautiful but doubtful details. Beautiful details can be misleading precisely because they are easy to remember. A strange sentence in a log. A meal left waiting. A chair overturned. Each image clings to the mind. By contrast, storm damage near a landing is harder to carry because it is practical, rough, and less theatrical. But the practical detail is often the one that matters. You can feel the discipline required to choose it. The detective's eye must prefer the useful clue to the memorable decoration. The useful clue, once chosen, brings us back outside again. The air changes. The page becomes rock underfoot. The west landing lies below or ahead, depending on where you stand. And the sea keeps moving with its old indifference. You look for the logic of work. Where would gear be stored? What might a storm disturb? How would keepers approach it? What would they see first? What might make one call for another? These questions are calm and grounded. They belong to the island. not to the legend. The island answers only partially. It can show exposure. It can suggest risk. It can make the sea theory feel physically plausible. But it cannot replay the day. You might stand there in good weather and find it hard to imagine the danger. You might stand there in rough weather and find it hard to imagine anyone approaching. The exact conditions matter, and exact conditions are gone. This is another reason the case went cold. The scene changes with every tide, every season, every storm, and the needed version of it no longer exists. Photographs, maps, and descriptions help, but they are substitutes. A photograph freezes 1 second, one angle, one weather condition. A map flattens height, force, and sound. A description chooses words from a larger experience. The Flannan case requires all of them, yet none can restore the decisive moment. You can use them like lanterns placed along a path. They help you walk carefully, but they do not turn night into day. There remains a place beyond their reach. That place beyond reach is where speculation begins, and speculation must be kept soft. Perhaps one man slipped and another tried to help. Perhaps gear drew them close to a dangerous edge. Perhaps a sudden sea caught all three near the landing. Perhaps the sequence was staggered by minutes. These are human possibilities, and none should be spoken as fact. You can let them drift in the mind like low cloud, present but not solid, while the firm ground remains the same. Firm ground is what investigators need most. In this case, firm ground was limited but meaningful. The men were gone. The light had not functioned as expected. The island showed severe weather effects. The official inspector saw reason to believe the sea took them. Nothing later has decisively displaced that view. These statements are not dramatic, but they are durable. They have survived the long weather of retelling. When the story grows too misty, you can return to them and feel the ground again. The ground beneath the lighthouse was ancient compared with the young tower. Rock shaped by weather long before the northern lighthouse board built there. That contrast is another quiet layer. Human engineering arrived with plans, glass, metal, and schedules. The island received it without changing its nature. The tower could stand, but it could not make the land gentle. The keepers could maintain the light, but they could not make every landing safe. The Flannan case reminds us that human order is real, and so are the forces around it. Real order existed in the lighthouse service. It should not be dismissed. The light did guide ships. The records did support oversight. The routines did protect workers most of the time. The disappearance stands out because the system usually functioned. A rare failure can become famous precisely because it breaks a dependable pattern. You can think of the Flannan case as a crack in a careful system, not as proof the system was fragile at every point. That makes the event more specific, and specificity is calming. Specificity keeps us from saying only lonely lighthouse, vanished men, ancient mystery. Those phrases may be true in a broad sense, but they blur the case. Better to say, Eilean Moor, December in the year 1900, the relief vessel Hesperus, Joseph Moore, Robert Muirhead, James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, Donald MacArthur, the West Landing, the likely sea accident. Each specific point is like a small weight holding the story down against wind. You can feel the narrative settle when the proper names return. The proper names also remind us of the cultural distance between the event and the myth. People who knew the men would not have first thought of them as figures in an eerie tale. They would have thought of character, family, competence, wages, duty, and loss. The myth came later, after the private grief had already begun. When we say their names, we step back toward the earlier, more human world. We leave behind the more polished mystery for a while and enter the rougher, truer place. Truth, in this case, is rough because it is incomplete. It does not have the smoothness of a solved puzzle. It has edges, the timing edge, the clothing edge, the the rule about keeping one man inside, the damaged landing, the missing bodies, the doubtful later details. Each edge can catch the mind. Patient reading does not sand them away. It simply arranges them so you can see which belong to the original object and which were added later. That arrangement is slow work, but satisfying in its quiet way. Satisfaction may seem like a strange word near an unresolved loss, yet there is a kind of satisfaction in clarity, not happiness, and not closure. Just the calm that comes when confusion is reduced. The Flannan case remains uncertain, but it need not be muddled. We can remove what is unsupported. We can honor what is known. We can name probability. We can leave mystery where it truly remains. This is the kind of careful order a bedtime retelling can offer without pretending to solve the unsolved. The sea outside the lighthouse offers no such order, at least not to the human eye. It has patterns, certainly, but they are vast and shifting. Swell, wind, tide, and rock all interact in ways that can surprise even those who know them. A keeper might know the station well and still meet a rare combination at the wrong moment. That thought is sobering, but not sensational. It is simply the reality of work at the edge. The edge is where the Flannan case lives. As we sit at that edge in thought, the sound lowers. The public arguments about theories grow distant. The invented log entries fade. The dramatic kitchen scene softens into uncertainty. What remains is a winter station and the patient effort to understand it. You can almost feel the file's weight changing, becoming less like a collection of mysteries and more like a record of limits. Limits of weather, technology, memory, and proof. Limits, too, of storytelling, if storytelling wants to be kind. Kind storytelling does not wake the listener with insistence. It lets the case breathe. It gives each detail room. The Hesperus does not rush toward the island in our telling. It approaches through delayed weather. Moore does not burst into a scene. He climbs, observes, and reports. Muirhead does not declare with dramatic certainty. He studies and concludes as far as evidence allows. The sea does not roar for effect. It moves steadily beyond the lighthouse walls, as it always did. And beyond those walls, the West Landing remains the place where the next part of the file asks us to stay a little longer, because the coldness of the case is not only in what happened there, but in how little the island could return once the weather had passed. Once the weather had passed, it had already done the kind of work no investigator could undo, smoothing the rocks, drawing back from the landing, and leaving only damage, absence, and the low sound of water below. You can rest there for a moment, not trying to force the island to speak more clearly than it ever has. The Flannan case was never solved in the full and final sense. No bodies were recovered. No witness came forward with the missing moment. And no later discovery has settled exactly how James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur disappeared from Eilean Moor. The official explanation has long remained that the men were most likely swept away by the sea while working near the West Landing, but the exact sequence stayed beyond proof, and that is why the file has kept its quiet, unfinished shape. So we leave the lighthouse as it was left to history, not empty of meaning, but empty of the one answer everyone wanted. The light returned to service, the sea continued around the island, and the rooms that once held voices became part of an old question carried gently through time. You do not have to solve it tonight. You can let the most careful answer be enough for now, and let the unknown remain where it has always been, beyond the door, past the rocks, under the long-breathing dark. The file can stay open without asking anything more of you, and the light can turn once, softly, across the water, while the island keeps its silence.